There we go. All right, test. 1, 2, 3. Well, talking about children and their learning makes me regret very much that my second book in the United States, which was called How Children Learn, was never published in Sweden. And it's too bad, because if you read How Children Fail, you really only got half of the message, and perhaps the least hopeful half. How Children Fail was almost entirely a description of children in school. As it happens, an extremely good private school with very high IQ children from very successful elite families in Boston. And these children were doing very badly in the two schools that I described. But in How Children Learn, I described children learning very well, learning with their full strength, their full power. On the other hand, these were not children in school. These were much younger children, 3-year-old, 2-year-old babies. And it is from these children, very young children, that I have learned almost everything I have learned about good learning, about true learning. And indeed, one of the reasons I think I am a much more successful, a much better learner today of music, of anything else it may be, than I was even 20 or 30 years ago, is because I am much more like a 2-year-old, at least in my learning, at least in my response, the way I respond to new things. One of the things that I like about traveling in a country where I don't know the language, and I know hardly a word of Swedish, I'm sorry about that. I would like to be able to talk to you in your own language, and I would like to understand it anyway, and it's a lovely language. But life is short. One of the things that I now enjoy about traveling in a country where I don't know the language is exactly one of the things that most adults least enjoy about it, and that it is in a small way like being 2 or 3 years old again. It is a way of catching it's a way of recovering at least a little bit of what it was like to be very young and to have everything around you mysterious. So I'm always asking myself questions. What's that say? What is that for? What are those people doing? Kinds of questions that little children ask themselves. The topic of my talk today, let me say one other thing. Perhaps Sweden has not altogether lost its chance at How Children Learn, because I have finished a revised version of both those first 2 books. And the revised version consists of the original book plus many second thoughts added to it. And the new How Children Fail will appear in the United States in a month or so, and the new How Children Learn perhaps next fall. So my publishers and I are hoping that we may be able to persuade some Swedish publisher to publish both of them. I hope so, because they are a very valuable addition to the original book. When I began, well, not for the first time, because I've read those books many times, and I must say I always enjoy them. But when I began reading them, thinking about, is this what I really think now, I could see that many things I wrote in those earlier books might have been misunderstood. Well, aside from that, How Children Fail was the story of how I, as a teacher, tried to learn more about the ways in which children think and the reasons for which they often do not learn. But along that journey of the mind, that voyage of the mind that I was taking, I made many mistakes. And I realize now that it might be possible for people to look at some of the things that I did when I was learning and think that those were the right things to do. Thus, I think it will be much harder to misunderstand the new book. Let me say in passing that though there were things in teaching as a subversive activity that I enjoyed, I did not feel that in that literature of school reform it was an important book. I thought George Dennison's writing or Herndon's, I did not think of it as one of the really important or fundamental books about school reform. I did not feel that Postman and Weingartner were strong allies, you know what I mean, and I am not at all surprised to see them saying that it's now important that boys in school should wear coats and ties or whatever other nonsense they're talking about. Like many other people who were involved in the school reform movement in the United States and perhaps Europe, their convictions did not go very deep. They were like a tree with shallow roots, and when the winds began to blow, the tree blew over. I like to think my own roots are deeper. What I believed then, I believe now only much more strongly. Now, I should say this, too. When I wrote How Children Fail and the original How Children Learn, and they were written about the same time, though not published at the same time, I had only just begun to look at young children. I had come to know very well the young children of my sisters and of a small handful of friends. And from what I had seen of these children, I had begun to suspect that certain things were true about young children and their learning. Today, I could no longer say that I suspect these things are true or think they may be true. I am as sure of them as I ever expect to be sure of anything in this world. Of course, you can't be sure of anything, but beyond, the sun may or may not rise tomorrow. I suppose in Sweden you're not sure if the thing exists anymore. It's not very different from our climate in Boston, you may be relieved to hear. But if I can say that I know anything, I think I know what I am going to say about young children's learning. I would bet my life on it. Since then, I have seen a great many more young children in public and private places, and I have come to know many of them. Also, since then, respectable, I am not respectable researchers in education, people with PhDs, people who write up long columns of figures, write numbers, people who use statistics and so forth, have done a great deal of looking at very young children and have confirmed just about everything I said about young children in that first book. In 1960, it was a very surprising thing to say that 2-year-olds were extremely intelligent. It's not surprising anymore among psychologists of learning. It's a thing that everybody takes for granted. The subject of the subject is large, and I'm only going to be able to touch very lightly on parts of it. The first thing I want to say about the learning of young children is that it begins at birth, if not sooner. Don't want to get into that. There is beginning to be considerable evidence that even before birth, the child or the fetus or whatever can hear, can receive certain signals from the environment in which it lives, can hear things outside the mother's skin, music, voices, and responds to these in many ways. But I don't claim to know anything about that. What we do know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that children begin learning when they are born. For a long, long time, people had an idea about young children which was expressed by a British philosopher, I can never remember whether it was Locke or Hume, who used the word tabula rasa, that's Latin for a blank slate, a blank sheet of paper. There was nothing in the mind of the baby or the infant. It was simply, and it remained blank until people, adults, parents, teachers, until you and I wrote something of it. And on the whole, that is still the way a great many people feel, I think, about very young children. So the first thing I will say is that the learning of young children begins at the beginning of their life. And the second thing I will say about it is that learning for young children is not a sideline, is not an incidental activity, is not a minor part of their life. It is at the very center of their life. They want and they need to make some kind of sense of the world around them as strongly as they need to eat or drink or sleep. Their need to understand, to make some kind of sense of the world is as strong as their need for food or sleep or shelter or comfort. It is a basic biological need. One very careful and loving observer of a young child who wrote her book, As It Happens, in 1900, described a scene in which a baby, a 6-month-old baby, so hungry that she was crying, and hungry babies feel pain. This hungry baby stopped eating or drinking and made signals and signs that she wanted to be held so that she could see something interesting that was happening in the room. Perhaps somebody else coming in, perhaps she didn't say what it was. All she said was that when this hungry child was being fed, if she heard something happening that was interesting to her, she would often give signals that she wanted to stop being fed and wanted to be held up so that she could see this interesting event. In other words, the desire, the curiosity of children is as powerful, as biological as hunger itself. Now, the reason I stress this is because this may seem like a not great difference, but the sweater's actually a lot hotter than the coat. There is still a strong feeling among educators, at least in the United States, and while I know almost nothing about Swedish education, I suspect it may be different, but not very different. I hope in this case that I'm wrong. In any case, there is a very, very strong feeling among most adults in the United States and in Canada and in Great Britain in countries that I know, that children are not particularly interested in learning. Indeed, that most of them will not learn unless they are made to, unless they are forced to. And that an important part of our job as adults, as teachers, is to make them. And this, I say, is a very great and very harmful mistake, and is one of the root causes, one of the deep causes for the problems and failures that we have in schools. So I say children, especially when they're young, particularly when they're the age that you will know, are extraordinarily eager, desperately, I would say, fiercely eager to make some kind of sense of the world that they live in. Now, the next thing I will say about children's learning is that they are active learners, not passive. When I say they are not passive learners, they do not simply sit there waiting for people to tell them things or show them things. Again, a very common idea among I think most adults and among a great many teachers is that children's minds are rather like empty containers, cans, coffee cups, glasses, whatever, sitting there waiting for us to pour knowledge into them. There's a little faint implication of this in that really very charming poster. But that sign says to us, really, that those little owls are not going to learn anything unless the big owl teaches. That's a very important hidden message, if that maybe not so hidden. Without the big owl, there would be no learning, is what that sign says. And that's not true. But a little ahead of my story. Children learn by, as I say, not just waiting to receive information. They are active seekers of and makers of learning. They ask questions, but I mean, many of them they ask with their voices, but even before they have words, the baby is in her crib is asking questions which she answers by holding on to things and putting them in her mouth and doing various things with them. The baby is, in the truest sense of the word, a scientist. That is to say, babies, infants, little children make theories. They don't experience them, perhaps. It may not make them in words. They don't think of them the way a physicist would think of his theories, but they have hunches about intuitions, vague ideas about how things really work, and they do experiments to test to see if these hunches are right. They are, in the most strict and literal sense of the word, they are scientists. And it's what they spend a large amount of their time doing when they're not eating or sleeping or... I will describe, this was in the original How Children Learn and is in the revised How Children Learn. I will describe one such experiment that I saw back in the early 60s when a niece of mine was only 2 years old. We were at dinner, we were having dinner, and this tiny child was saying, pass the salt, pass the pepper, pass the butter, pass the bread. Well, I had already come to believe that the things that very little children do are important and interesting, and that we can learn a great deal from them. I have learned much more from them than they have from me. And if you do your work well, that will be true of you as well. So I watched. The other people in the family were courteous to this little child, and I want to say that I was in the Stadsbibliotek, the big library at Gothenburg yesterday, listening to some records because I happen to like a lot of Swedish classical music. In fact, I know more Swedish classical music than most Swedes or maybe most Swedish musicians, but that's another topic. And I was listening to things in the library that would be very hard to find in my country, and that music listening place in the head library is beautiful anyway. And as I was there were a number of young children. The youngest, I don't think any older than 4 little boys, listening to some story with his eyes this big around. Just lovely. But there were many children at 7 or 8, and they would come up to the 2 ladies who ran the listening place and ask them this or that, since they were all speaking Swedish. I don't know what they were asking. But what struck me, and it is one of the things that I like about Sweden, and one of the things that I'm afraid I often don't like at home, is how very courteous these grown-up women were to the children. They talked to the children as they would talk to me. And by that I mean not only did they talk as politely as they did to me, but in exactly the same tone of voice. They did not talk to the children as so many teachers do at home, in a very different voice. You may have heard it. That's what I call ootsy wootsy. This kind of, they talk to them as if they were serious, grown-up, real people. And it made me very happy to see that. I think. Well, the grown-up or the bigger people in this little girl's family treated her that way. So when she asked them to pass something, they didn't say, "What do you want it for?" or "You don't need that," or whatever. They just passed it. But I was watching what she did, and I noticed after a while that when she had the salt, she didn't put it on the food, and when she had the butter, she wasn't eating any of this stuff. So I thought, why is she doing this? And after a while, I had a hunch, a faint idea, an intuition, which is now strong and certain, that she was asking us to pass these things so that she could test her ideas about what these things were named, what they were called. I think she already had a faint idea that this thing here was salt, and this was pepper, and this was butter. And this was the experiment that she did to see whether her idea was correct. And it was. Well, I don't know. Maybe sometimes she found out that she was right, and maybe not. But at any rate, she was doing an experiment to strengthen, or as we say, to confirm, just as a scientist does an experiment to confirm a hunch, which she or he would call a theory or a hypothesis, so this child was doing this little experiment to confirm her hunches about the meanings of words. Since then, I have known many children, even a little younger children, at that very difficult stage when they are just when they are ready to have a lot of words but don't have any. They are fiercely eager to talk, but they have discovered that the baby talking they've been doing for some time is not real talk, and now they want to talk the way big people do, and they don't have any of the words. It's one of the reasons why people of that size are so angry much of the time. And I have by now many times been around such children and seen them look at certain things or point to certain things and make some kind of insistent, demanding, I think most people who hear that think that the children want whatever they're pointing at. So they say, well, you can't have that television. Or, no, you can't. They don't. If they named it, it would be all right. No, you can't have it. Or if they're pointing at a clock or a watch, they say, no, you'll break it, or etc. But what the children are usually saying is, what's it called? That's all they want to find out. And when I have said, well, that's a television set, or that's a watch, or that's a clock, clearly they're satisfied. That was what they wanted to know. Then they look at something else. So but mind you, I think it's important to understand that they have probably already got a hunch that they are not so much collecting facts as confirming theories. By the time they get around to these games, they probably, in many cases at any rate, they may already have a pretty good idea. All right, so they are experimenting. They are makers of learning. They make learning from their curiosity, their sharp eyes and ears, the questions they ask, the things they do. They make learning from their thinking. And this is important because, again, I think most people in the countries that I know well, and I would suspect a great many people in Sweden, a great many teachers, think that nothing is learned unless it is first taught. That learning is the product and the result of teaching. And that is a very serious and destructive, harmful mistake. It took me a long time as a teacher of children of many different ages to discover that as I taught less, they learned more. In fact, I will now say that it is, except for that teaching which is asked for, and of course when a little child points and says, the child is asking for teaching. Okay, then teach. That's a television set. That's what we call a television set. But except for teaching that is asked for, teaching tends to prevent learning rather than help learning. Unasked for, uninvited teaching gets in the way of learning, prevents, slows it down, stops it altogether more than helping it. That will seem unasked for, uninvited teaching gets in the way of learning, prevents, slows it down, stops it altogether more than helping it. That will seem perhaps a surprising thing to say. There are, I think, several reasons why teaching which has not been asked for by the learner prevents, slows down, impedes, prevents learning. One reason is that the two reasons are very closely connected. We publish in the United States, perhaps you've seen a copy of it, this magazine called Growing Without Schooling, which is about children who are learning with their parents at home instead of going to school. Most of the material we print are letters from parents. People write us about their children, and they say, this is what she did, and this is what he did, and this is what he said. So there is a great body of information here about real live children and learning. There is nothing that compares to it in the English language that I have seen. Many of the letters are from mothers who tell us the same sad story. I went to help my little 2.5 or 3-year-old little girl or little boy. She was doing this, he was doing that. Maybe they were working with a computer trying to tie their shoes or something. I offered them some help with all my love, and they got furiously angry with me. No! And the mothers reeled back, and thinking, why is my dear little child so angry at me when all I wanted to do was to help her or help him? And they write us these suffering letters, and I write back, and we print them in the magazine. And they got furiously angry with me. No! And the mothers reeled back, and thinking, why is my dear little child so angry at me when all I wanted to do was to help her or help him? And they write us these suffering letters, and I write back, and we print them in the magazine. I know you meant well, and I'm sorry that your feelings were hurt, but this is a terribly important thing to understand. When one person says to another, without being asked, I am going to teach you something, that carries two hidden messages. That statement carries two hidden messages, very often unconscious messages. It says two things that we might not want to say, but it says them nonetheless. And the first is, you are too stupid to understand why this is important, why this is something you should know. And the second is, even if you understood that it was important, you were still too stupid to learn it or to figure it out for yourself with your questions and your experiments. So I am going to have to do all that work for you. Now, by the time we get to be even 6, 7, 8 years old, certainly 10, 12, we are used to hearing people say this to us, and it may not make us angry. It does us harm, but it may not make us angry. But very little children are extremely good at hearing the emotional meaning of what we say. They really, like a very good radio, they hear these messages which we may not even know we are sending. And the 2-year-old, the 3-year-old, who is already a fiercely proud and dignified human being, hears the loving, kindly mother or father or teacher saying, I know you're a nice little person, but you're still too stupid to see that this is important and too stupid to figure it out, and it makes them angry. And I say to these mothers, they are right to be angry. So don't do that. A Catholic educator, a lovely old man who's been teaching all his life, once said in the United States to a group of teachers, well, but I have to give you the original proverb, because you may not know it in English. Probably one like it in Swedish. A word to the wise is sufficient, is enough. Meaning only one word to the wise is enough. Now, don't tell people more than they need to be told. It's the original message of that, particularly if they are already pretty smart. But he turned it into something more than that, and really more important. He said a word to the wise is infuriating. Makes them very angry, because there is that element of insult in it. And I would go further and say that a word to the wise or the unwise is infuriating, is insulting. Now, unasked for teaching, and I have to say unasked for testing, is a statement of no confidence. So do not. Now, this is going to be difficult for you in a classroom situation, but as far as you can manage it, do not teach what people have not, do not give information that people have not asked for, because they will hear this as an insult. Now let me here make a distinction, a difference between a question and a quiz. I mean, school tests are quizzes. I ask you a question if, not knowing something, I ask you because I think you may know it. If I say, how would I get back into Gothenberg? I don't know how, unless some kindly taxi driver takes me back, I might be here the rest of my life. Oh no, I'm smarter at figuring out things than that, but it would be a long time. So I don't know even which direction Gothenberg is. So if I were to say to you, which way is it, I would be asking a question. I don't know. I think you know. I ask so that you can tell me. A quiz is something very different. I ask you a quiz if, already knowing something, I ask you in order to be sure that you know it. Now, most of the so-called questions that teachers ask children are really quizzes, and they also are insulting, because if I ask you a quiz, there is a strong suspicion in my mind that you don't really know. When I give you a little quiz, it is as if I was saying, I don't think you've really learned this, so I'm going to ask you this question to be sure. And little children are again offended by these, and their mothers write me and say they have asked their children questions to find out whether they know the name of this or whatever. And the children sometimes will get angry. Very often they will not answer, or they will say, I don't know, but that doesn't mean they don't know. It means they don't want to tell you, because they know you already know. They don't like being asked dumb questions. Or they may give a nonsense answer. Very often that happens. And it therefore very often happens that teachers will make a judgment about what children know based on these answers. They will ask a child a quiz question, and the child will say, I don't know, and the teacher will think, oh. Or the child may give some silly answer, some deliberately wrong answer, and again the teacher will think, oh goodness, I have a problem, I have to teach something. You cannot tell what children know by asking them quiz questions. You have to be more patient than that. You have to watch. You have to join them in real conversations in which you are truly taking part as equals. And they may like to talk to you, probably will like to talk to you about what they do and what interests them, but not if they think that you are talking just to check up on them, just to catch their mistakes. Children learn by asking the next big thing. Children learn very often by asking big questions. And they ask questions because they want to find out something. They want to understand the world better right now. Wait a minute, perhaps there's something I want to say first. All right, there is something I want to put first. Children are not just eager to learn about the world in order to make more sense of it, in order to have a better idea of how it works and what is happening. They want to be able to do things in it. They look for not only, as we say, understanding or knowledge, but what we would say in English, mastery, to master a skill. Maestro in music means that. Competence, skill, to be able to do things. And what they want to be able to do is what we do. Many people who write about, many psychologists, more psychologists than teachers, who write about rethinking the emotional life of young children, talk about infant omnipotence, meaning omnipotent, being able to do everything, like Superman. And their theory is that little children live in some kind of fantasy world in which they can do everything, and that they get angry when they find out that they can't do everything. And I think this view is a great mistake. Children do not want to be able to do everything. I guess Superman is about as well known in Sweden as in the United States. And if you know Superman, he can leap tall buildings with a single bound and run faster than a speeding bullet, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And these are not things that little children want to do. These are adult fantasies, made up by adults, commercially packaged, sold, marketed these things by adults. And it's possible that if children watch enough of this, they may make those adult fantasies their own. But that's not where they start. Children don't want to be able to do everything. They simply want to be able to do what they see us do. Walk around, run machines, eat when we feel like it, go to bed when we feel like it, put on our own clothes, do things, cook, bake bread, or fix the car, or run the, They want to be able to do what the big people do. And again, one of the reasons why they are so often angry when they're 2 or 3 is that they keep finding out that they can't do, they're not yet able to do what the big people do. Although they can very quickly become able if we let them. What makes them even angrier is if we don't let them try. If we say, well, no, you can't touch that tape recorder, you'll just break it, and so forth. They want to know how to run it, and they want to know how to do things right. They are enormously interested in our world. And I guess I want to say 2 things at the same time here. And almost all of their fantasy and play is not an escape from the world. It's not a way to get out of the real world and into some world in which they have in which they can do everything. Their fantasy and play is a way to get further into the real world. This is one of the few places where I think, for example, Maria Montessori is completely off the mark. So I think of a friend of mine, the young friend who will be listening to this tape. Since she was, perhaps 4 years old, she has been very interested in the checks which her parents write and use to pay the bills and so forth. And when these checks come back from the bank, having all those things done to them, and their parents have written in the checkbook or balanced the checkbook or whatever, they have given all these checks to this little girl. And on her little desk made out of a box with her papers and pencils, and on it she has a pile of these checks. And for some time now she has been reading them and looking at them. They're magical to her. They are a window into the adult world. They are a part of that mysterious game which all of us play, and that she wants to play too, that she wants to be part of. And so she asks, how much is that? And the parents say $23.79 or $112.49. So maybe if it's a tax bill, $1,100.38. Now the little girl is not asking questions about checks so that she can learn about numbers. She's asking questions about checks because she's interested in how grown-ups live and what they do with their money. The fact is that she has learned to read numbers, to turn written numbers into word numbers, by looking at checks, also at catalogs. Now the idea that lies behind a great deal of education in the United States, and I suspect Sweden, is that we have to teach children a lot of little teeny facts which by themselves mean nothing. Rather like stringing beads on a string, Here's a little fact bead, goes down to the end of the string, and then here's another little fact bead which the wise old owl tells the child, and this bead goes down to the end of the string. Pretty soon we've got a whole lot of beads on the string, and then we can use these to make some important idea out of it. First, meaningless facts, and then when we have enough meaningless facts, we can think about how to make meaning out of them. That is the traditional and conventional, and maybe still the majority notion. But that isn't the way children work. They begin with the idea, the big question, the world, the adult activity. And then as they try to do that and find out more about it, they learn more and more of the facts. Or at any rate, that is the way they learn best. This child says to her mother, when we put money in the bank, meaning this dollar bill, and then later we get money out of the bank, do they give us back the same bill? It's quite a sensible question. The mother says no. Well, what did they do with it? She said, when all the people put the money in the bank, does that money just sit there? Well, no, it doesn't. As a matter of fact, I hope you know, that it's only a small part of the money that people have put in a bank that stays in the bank. And the bank only has to keep on hand 10 or 15 or 20% of its total deposits. The rest is free to lend or one thing or another. So the child says, well, what happens to the rest of it? This child is not interested in numbers. She's interested in economics and banking and finance and that whole and very important mysterious world. What I think this has to do with you in classroom situations is that the point I want to make here is that the more of the real adult world, including bank checks and bank statements and tax forms and bills and invoices and so forth, the more of the real adult world you can bring into your classroom, the more children are going to be interested in it. And the more they are then going to be interested in doing whatever you have to do in order to be part of that world. Now, they're not all going to be interested. This child's brother has absolutely no interest in checks. So I'm not saying, let's design a new curriculum built around checks. That's the mistake we keep making in education. We keep looking for the magic curriculum. What I'm trying to say here is that no two children explore the world by the same path. So our job is not to design the best possible path and then try to make all children walk along that path. Our job is to, and it's a big job, not easy, is to find ways to make it possible for children to explore the world as well as they can on whatever paths they think are best. Checks if they like checks, animals if they like animals, rockets if they like rockets, sports if they like sports, whatever it may be. The advantage that we have over them is not that we're better at learning than they are, because we're not as good as they are. They are extremely good at learning. I guess I meant to say that earlier. They are able to exist in situations which are so uncertain and confused that if we were to try to live in such a place, it would drive us crazy. And very few of us could tolerate the amount of ignorance and uncertainty and confusion with which little children live, and perfectly happily, every day. We need to know really quick. I mean, they can ask all kinds of questions and wait to figure out the answer. All right. But the advantage that we have over them is that we do know a lot more about what is out there and how to find it. You know more about Gothenberg than I do. If I want to get someplace in Gothenberg, how would I get to this or that or the other? Well, I bought a map last year. Found a map in the railroad station, and it took quite a little bit of hunting around before I could find it. So time I found out where the hotel was, I knew how to get to the other spots, and so forth and so forth. But we know about maps and how to read maps. And we know what's out there, and we know much more, or we have friends who know if we don't know, who can find out, so that if a child gets interested, and some do, in chemistry, you don't have to know chemistry unless you want to learn it. And these parents don't have to learn chemistry. All they have to know is how to get a hold of somebody who does know something about chemistry. Well, only one more thing I say, and very quickly. Children want to do things right. They want to do them well. Again, there is this notion among teachers in my country that children will never notice a mistake unless it's pointed out, and they will never correct it unless they are natives. And here is another insulting and infuriating assumption. Long experience has showed me that if they are given enough time and not made ashamed or fearful, children will, in reading, in writing, in much of their work in arithmetic, will notice, will find, and will correct many or most of their own mistakes. But they may not do it right away, because the 5-year-old child just learning to write and writing a message, a letter, a sign for her room, keep out, dangerous, do not come in, very common. Or a poem, or a newspaper, or even what they might call a story or a book. The important thing is the book, the story. The important thing is the big activity. And they're not going to say, well, I'm not going to write anything until I can be sure I spell everything perfectly. Here again, the idea that we teach children to do a lot of little things which are not interesting, not meaningful, so that later on they may do some big and meaningful and interesting thing, has it turned completely backwards. They want to start doing big things right away. Eventually they will want to do them the way we do. They want very much to have their writing look like ours and so forth, and to be able to run machines the way we do. But they're not, most of them are not willing to say, I'm not, it's only adults for the most part, or scared children, or we can make them like this. Indeed, most of the children in How Children Fail who were 10 years old were like this. I won't do anything unless I can be sure of doing it right. But that's not what they're like when they're little, and I hope they won't be like that. And you know this. Well, all right. That's enough speech. When do we come to a stop here? 9:30. I'll stop the speech here. There's probably much more to be said. And we can have some questions or comments. Now, there are 3 ways in which we can do this. You may say something in English if you feel you want to do it that way, or you could ask a question and make it a remark in Swedish, in which case somebody will translate, or you could write it down, I guess. If you write it in English, I can read it. If you write it in Swedish, somebody else will have to. But anyway, I will await your questions or comments. Whether this is is this an optimistic statement or not? I don't know. There isn't any reason why schools couldn't run like this if they wanted to.
What remains for teachers to do is learning to build the knowledge of teaching.
What remains for us to do is to give children access. Is to make available to children. Is to what I've said about the math of Göteborg is to provide them catalogs. Children love to read catalogs, because those catalogs tell them something about what is out there. We know much more than they do about what is out there and what people do with it and how they can find it. We're like travel agents. When I knew I was going to make this trip, I went to a travel agent in Boston, and she arranged found out what was the best way to fly to Stockholm, and bought the train passes and made various other arrangements. She didn't tell me where I had to go, and she didn't go with me, and she isn't going to give me a quiz when I get home to make sure I went there. It's like libraries. It's like the library I went to last night. I think the library is a very good model of what schools might be in a much larger sense than just books and records. Nobody said I had to go. Nobody tested me to see whether I was intelligent enough to come in. Nobody told me what to do. Nobody gave me a quiz when I went out to make sure I had done it. All they did was, when I went down to the record room, and I said, if I want to listen to a particular record, what information do I have to give you at the counter? I looked at the catalog. Do you need any of these numbers? No. The lady said, we just need the name of the composer and the name of the work. So, as it happens, because I've been in libraries before, I found the card catalog. If I hadn't been able to